Well, the French government is wrestling with one of the biggest crises to hit the agriculture sector in recent years. French farmers have been demonstrating against high costs in the industry, cheap imports, low salaries, and the impact of the environmental transition, as well as price pressures from the retail sector. Cullen reports.
David Comet is a livestock farmer in Garrigues, in the idyllic southern French countryside. But farming can be a precarious profession, and as costs grew, he had to diversify his economic output. The path he took was not made of mud and manure, but rather dancers and dresses. David opened the first cabaret on a farm in France. His story inspired this 2022 film. David farms the same land his family has for generations, but he says the agricultural world of today has completely changed from the past.
Qu'à l'époque de mon grand-père, quand il produisait du blé, il vendait du blé au prix du blé et il vivait du revenu que ça générait. À mon époque à moi, quand je vends du blé, j'attends d'avoir une subvention pour être sûr de pouvoir payer mes charges. Si je n'ai pas la subvention, je ne peux pas payer mes charges. Donc ce principe de la politique agricole commune, il a des choses de bien, mais il a des choses de mal.
While he diversified his farm's output, not everyone can turn the sawdust into stardust. Behind the curtain lie major structural problems in French agriculture. What started out as a few protests in rural corners of the country spiraled into a full-blown cross-border crisis. This was the scene in January on France's A1 motorway, normally one of Europe's busiest roads. Farmers brought tractors and trailers onto the highway as part of a Europe-wide movement calling for less regulation and greater protection from international competition. That puts farmers at odds with EU policies emphasizing free trade as well as implementing sometimes costly environmental standards. The Paris Agriculture Show is one of the biggest farming fairs in the world. This year, more than 600,000 people attended February's event.
When the farming protests expanded in January, it meant there was always going to be a renewed focus on this year's event and unavoidable pressure on government ministers attending.
The French president traditionally inaugurates the show on its opening day. This year, Emmanuel Macron did not get a warm welcome. The French Prime Minister has announced new financial support for farmers, bans on some imports treated with pesticides, and a pledge to write the principle of food sovereignty into law.
Nous souhaitons ce matin vous présenter cette nouvelle étape. Elle commence par un message clair, avec deux mots d'ordre pour notre agriculture: produire et protéger. Pourquoi ? Parce que nous voulons être souverains. Souverains pour cultiver, souverains pour récolter, souverains pour nous alimenter.
Christophe Rionneau is a cattle farmer in Saint-Gemme, also in the south of France. He argues that the build-up of crises, from drought to the green transition, the effects of the war in Ukraine, and elevated inflation have taken their toll on countryside communities. He spent a long time at the tractor protests earlier in the year, but he also knows that his sector must be future-proof.
On a une réflexion sur nos exploitations pour les faire progresser sur la question climatique, le travail avec les énergies renouvelables, avec la méthanisation de demain, sur l'alimentation de notre cheptel, fait que dans les années qui viennent, on aura une empreinte carbone nulle, ce qui est dans le monde de la viande quelque chose d'exceptionnel.
Agriculture only employs about 3% of the French labour force and contributes about 2% to gross domestic product. But France is the EU's leading agricultural nation, and there is outsized public support for an industry seen as feeding the country through arduous work passed down through generations. Cullen, CNA, Paris and southern France.